VR61661, report to precinct headquarters, code 3, repeat code 3.
I was just finishing up my 12 out on patrol when I got the call. Welcome relief considering that the most action I'd seen all night was a schizoid grandmother doing the shimmy in her underwear in the second sector.
VR61661, report to division headquarters, code 3, repeat code 3.
So hello once again from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Now, the only thing better than socialism, in my opinion, is cyberpunk media, which often goes nicely in hand with socialist views of the world because a lot of cyberpunk is inherently anti-capitalist. Now, the reason I want to make this video is there are two important anniversaries this year, and one very important anniversary actually this week. And that is surrounding both Blade Runner films. So the original Blade Runner turned 40 this year, but Blade Runner 2049 turns 5 years old this week. I think it came out on the 6th of October, and that first teaser trailer for the film got me so hyped, you know, all the right notes. I never watched any other trailer, and I went in, watched the film, absolutely loved it, my favorite film of all time. Gonna talk about that a bit more when we move past the intro, but I thought for today's video to honor two of my favorite films and something that I like really love as this like aesthetic and genre is do more of a deep dive into both movies, talk about what has influenced them, talk about the inherent Orientalism, Xenophobia, and racism that comes with cyberpunk, and even modern cyberpunk, including Cyberpunk 2077, does still have a lot of these tropes because its conception did have all these things in it. Just like how we talked about how J.R.R. Tolkien influenced the fantasy genre and how a lot of the construction of Lord of the Rings was based in a racist European colonialist view of the world, and how that has had lots of repercussions on the genre as a whole. And people often get quite precious when we dissect things like this, but I love cyberpunk, and that's why I like to talk about this stuff even more. Doesn't make you a racist for liking it, doesn't make you some sort of bigot or xenophobe for liking it, but it's important to acknowledge these things, so going forward, the genre, the subgenre, can be better. And Blade Runner 2049 actually already did this. You guys might not have known it because you're watching that film and you see like the Japanese / Asian aesthetic still there in part, you know, the food, the sushi. But when you delve a bit deeper, you realize the film is actually influenced by Eastern and Central Europe and Canada more than anything to do with Tokyo or Hong Kong. So all of that coming up for you today. Before we go any further, please like the video, and in the comments, what is your favorite thing about cyberpunk, or what is your favorite thing adjacent to cyberpunk? Like, what is your favorite soundtrack? What is your favorite game? What is your favorite like scene of a movie even? And we're going to be talking a lot about Blade Runner, but I absolutely loved Stray, that cat game that came out recently. I have so many screenshots which are like the wallpaper on my phone, the wallpaper on my computer and stuff. I absolutely love Stray's aesthetic, and people were calling this like post-cyberpunk because, you know, there's no humans left, there's no like system of capitalism in there or anything like that. It's just about like these robots and this cat. But yeah, I really love that game, and I really love the aesthetic, and I really love the soundtrack. So you guys let me know in the comments, what is your favorite cyberpunk thing? Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, but also on Instagram. And speaking of like Asia and cyberpunk, currently I am living in Vietnam, as you guys all know. I'm posting a lot about Vietnam and pictures, and I'll probably throw some on screen right now. Here are some pictures that felt very like cyberpunk-y, although Vietnam and Hanoi itself isn't like as built up as certain Chinese cities or Japanese cities. I still did feel like the aesthetic I like is represented in Hanoi with a more interesting twist, because you have the contrast of like modern skyscrapers with old French colonial buildings. I'm actually living in an old French colonial building right now. So if you care about any of that stuff, please check out my Instagram. Also consider becoming a patron. I'm trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, the benefits of which are getting access to the private patrons Discord server and my Nintendo Switch friend code. And I'm going to be making one exclusive patron video per month-ish, talking about my travels. So I'm going to do one on Vietnam soon, and that should be up, and I'll message everyone when it is posted. Also check out the second channel, Kavernacle Extra, and also check out the subreddit down in the description. So before we get into like the serious stuff and talk about like the politics of Blade Runner 2049, Cyberpunk 2077, and just Cyberpunk as a whole, I just wanted to talk to you about how much I love both the Blade Runner movies on their anniversaries. Now, Blade Runner 1, I was immediately obsessed with it after I watched it. Like, the soundtrack, I don't need to tell you guys, absolutely amazing. I listen to it pretty much every day or every other day. And I can understand people not liking the first movie in terms of like pure narrative, but I feel like the purpose of the first movie is just the vibe, is just the immersion. I recently saw it in a cinema for the first time. Looks absolutely amazing still, and just the use of practical effects, the use of all these extras really creates a real lived-in feel to LA in 2019, and it's something that is so lost in today's movies, and even to an extent, the newer Blade Runner, because you just can't capture that vibe the way the first Blade Runner did, and you can see how it basically constructed the cyberpunk visual aesthetic as a whole. You know, we can talk about Neuromancer and stuff like that, but it really is Blade Runner which made this insanely popular, especially with its like re-releases and stuff like that. And beyond the soundtrack, the way the sound is produced and weaved in to the soundtrack, like the echoiness of it, again, it's just so good and creates such an immersive experience. And I think that's what the first one really excels at, because on the surface, the plot is pretty like basic and generic, very philosophically interesting, of course, and a very interesting world building. Does take a lot from the book, but the world the book creates really isn't that much like the world of the film. In my head, when I read the book, I'm thinking about like that Las Vegas scene in Blade Runner 2049 with all this like dust everywhere, and then you have that whole like religious aspect with that Mercer guy and stuff. The book is very different. I would recommend reading it. But now let's move on to 2049, because I do think 2049 is the superior movie, and I think in a traditional way it's superior. Like, the narrative is better, the pacing is better in my opinion, despite being far longer, and I also think the world it constructed is so interesting as a vision of the Blade Runner world in the future, because Gone is the more like Asian aesthetic, the Tokyo/Hong Kong aesthetic. The first Blade Runner is a world you want to go to. Like, I would want to go to the Blade Runner world maybe for a day, maybe for a week to stay in, because visually it's so, you know, nice to look at. But the second world is so bleak. It literally is capitalism gone to its horrible conclusion. Like, the whole world is like stripped of all natural resources. You can clearly see how it's more inspired by Eastern Europe, by the Soviet Union, by Russia, by Hungary, where it was filmed, a lot of it. And the soundtrack is also amazing in this one. Like, I think I might even prefer it. And I just love the dynamic between Kay and his AI girlfriend, Joy. I think everyone does really well as their characters in this. And I just think the visuals, especially in the first hour and a half, are just so amazing. I really love the bleakness of it, and I think that's something that really appeals to me about Cyberpunk. Like, I'm a guy who loves like ugly buildings and overcast weather, and I think that's why I like Blade Runner 2049's aesthetic as much as I like Blade Runner the original's aesthetic. So I could gush over these movies all day and all night, but I think we've got to move on in the interest of time. This video is going to be really long anyway. And I wanted to talk about the first Blade Runner film. So each Blade Runner film is very interesting as being like this little time capsule of the creators involved, and just the visuals being inspired by certain places. So of course the first Blade Runner is inspired by Hong Kong and Tokyo. Hong Kong is interesting because it's a place kind of caught, especially at this time, between the East and between the West, as it used to be a British territory, but still very much has this massive Chinese influence. But we are going to talk about the Orientalism, because I feel like it's pretty hard to distinguish like what cultures are being represented in Blade Runner. But also something that was interesting to me, and I didn't find this out until a couple years later, is that Blade Runner's aesthetic is actually influenced a lot by Ridley Scott's upbringing in post-World War II England. So I just have an article from the BBC from ages ago which talks about its influence on like Newcastle and Hartlepool of all places. So the BBC, we are Teesside, the Blade Runner connection. This is probably one of the first claims to fame people hear about Teesside. The dramatic opening shot of the sci-fi classic Blade Runner was based on Teesside's Wilton chemical plant. You only have to look at the futuristic cityscape of the film with its mix of bright lights, industrial hulks and flames licking into the sky to be convinced that it's based on Teesside. You can see an identical vista from the parkway and Wilton Castle. Add to that the fact that director Ridley Scott spent a large chunk of his younger years living on Teesside and it's a done deal. Anyway, Ridley Scott has talked openly about how he based the look on the old ICI works. Ridley talking about this: the industrial landscape in West Hartlepool would later inspire visuals in Blade Runner, with Scott stating, "There were steelworks adjacent to West Hartlepool, so every day I'd be going through them and thinking, they're kind of magnificent, beautiful, winter or summer, and the darker and more ominous it got, the more interesting it got." So I thought that was interesting, just a bit of northern industrial England having an influence on this, amazing, mainly Asian influence sci-fi city of Los Angeles. But the BBC ran a load of good articles in 2019 because Blade Runner is set on November 20th, 2019, day after my birthday. And just talking about like what the film got right is quite interesting. So Blade Runner arguably gets something much more fundamentally right about 2019, which is the world's socio-political outlook, and that isn't particularly welcome. According to Mishi Trotter, who is a media critic and the non-fiction editor of the science fiction periodical Uncanny Magazine, it's disappointing to say the least that what Blade Runner predicted accurately is a dystopian landscape shaped by corporate influences and interests, mass industrialization's detrimental effect on the environment, the police state and the whims of the rich and powerful, resulting in chaos and violence suffered by the socially marginalised. Trotter believes there is something prescient in the replicants' frustration and rage at their shortened lifespans, resulting from corporate greed and indifference that's echoed in the current state of US healthcare and globalised exploitation of workers. I'd have vastly preferred the flying cars instead. As for the devastating effects of pollution and climate change evident in Blade Runner and the sequel, the environmental collapse the film so vividly depicts is not too far off from where we are today, says science fiction writer Matthew Kressel, pointing to a picture of a 2013 Beijing smog, and we're currently undergoing the great mass extinction since the dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. Also what Death Stranding talks about, released on the day Blade Runner is set, November 20th, 2019. Kojima loves his film references. The film's depiction of haves and have-nots, those who are able to live comfortable lives while the rest live in squalor, is remarkably parallel to the immense disparity in wealth between the world's richest and poorest areas today. In that sense, the film is quite accurate. So of course, Blade Runner was constructed in the time of Ronald Reagan, the widespread adoption of neoliberal economic policies across the Western world. So from that perspective, and a guy from like a more industrialized part of England, you can probably see why Ridley Scott envisioned a future like this, one ruled by corporations where the wealthy and the healthy, based on the books and the TV show, go off-world to the new outer-world colonies, which are full of like new wealth, exploitation through the use of a slave labor force. The replicants and everyone else is just left to the hellhole that is 2019 Earth. So now I'm going to talk more about the racism and Orientalism of the first Blade Runner, which has really had a lasting effect on putting all this stuff in cyberpunk as a whole. So if you guys don't know what Orientalism is, Orientalism was coined by Edward Said, who wrote a whole book called Orientalism, and it's basically about this imagined Orient. You guys would have heard of this if you studied like European colonialism, for example, especially Britain. Now, the Orient was from the Middle East to China to India, and it was basically the British view of this, more backwards lifestyle, this more exotic lifestyle, which they constantly fetishize, but also use it to convince themselves that Europeans are more civilized, therefore better, and therefore should rule over other people. So there's various things that are important, but one of the most important things is this aspect of power and knowledge that Said talks about. It might even be in the first chapter. And if you're like a poli-sci basic bitch, if you've done political science at university, or even history, I did it in history as well, you would have learned about Orientalism and Edward Said. So basically, he takes the time to talk about this guy called Lord Cromer, who was this big official in Egypt, came home, wrote a bunch of books about Egypt, talking about how Egyptians are like very, very lazy and they're sneaky and they want to cheat, they never want to do an honest day's work, stuff like that. But because he's powerful and because he got all these books published, most British people would accept the stereotype that Egyptian people are all these things, and Egyptians couldn't really challenge this. Like, who could challenge this? Who had the power to challenge someone like Lord Cromer? Although this isn't a great example, it's like me with like my 80,000 YouTube subs, and I could go to like a rural part of Vietnam, which I did, could go on my channel, talk about how horrible everyone is there, how, you know, they are X, Y, and Z, and then that could become the knowledge. Of course, in the social media age, it is a lot different. Of course, loads of Vietnamese people use the internet constantly. There's Vietnamese YouTubers who could easily challenge me, but you kind of get what I'm saying. If you have the power, you can kind of convince a certain community what something looks like, and you can kind of combine all these elements into like this Orient package. And that is kind of what Blade Runner has a problem with, in that it takes an Asian aesthetic, throws a bunch of Asian cultures together in a blender, and you have the cyberpunk world. So the guy who makes Replicant's eyes is a Chinese-American actor, right? James Hong. Then in the film, you have like geishas used in advertisements. Geishas are from Japan. And it's really, really not clear what culture is which to most people, because there isn't really nuance in understanding this. You have Hong Kong, China, Tokyo, Japan, all just mixed into a blender, and that is just used for the aesthetic without trying to tell any story about Asian people in this world or try and use any nuance. And then Cyberpunk 2077 has a similar problem where you have stuff like the Tiger Claws, which are like an Asian gang. And although you have like Japantown and Chinatown, it really doesn't feel like the world does enough to distinguish between the different nationalities or ethnic groups. But adding even more problematic aspects to Cyberpunk is how the whole of the world is just like flooded by Asian peoples as well. And it really reminded me of how America and other, you know, colonial projects were built, often using Chinese/Asian labor to construct all these projects, but then they were treated like subhuman, they were treated awfully. America enacted loads of laws against Asian communities and stuff like that. But then there's something more modern playing into these fears, is that in the 1980s, it was strongly believed that Japan would become the new capitalist hegemonic power. And there was a lot of anger and resentment in the US because they believed that they'd propped Japan up, they had rebuilt Japan after World War II, and now Japan were stabbing them in the back by flooding the US market with consumer electronics. And just like 2049 shows our fears about climate change especially, what the original Blade Runner has is showing the xenophobic fears of the Japanese takeover of the world. So let's get into this article just about the Japanese economy during this period. So Foundation for Economic Education by John Phelan. 80s fears of a Japanese economic Pearl Harbor look silly today, but they're instructive. So between 1963 and 67, the Kennedy round of talks took place under the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, followed by the Tokyo round and Uruguay round. Together, these reduced tariff rates in all the developed nations by about a third. Superior productivity gave Japanese producers an edge in these newly competitive markets with things like cars. Economist David Flath explains, process innovations that had been developed at Toyota in the 50s and 60s and then diffused to other Japanese companies had lowered production costs of the Japanese auto manufacturers and boosted their exports. Then the rising gasoline prices arising from the two oil shocks switched demand away from the large American cars towards Japanese imports. Between 1975 and 1982, which Blade Runner is set, Japanese manufacturers' share of total US new car sales rose from 9% to 22%. Then as now, the US found itself buying more stuff from than it was selling to a particular trade partner, resulting in a trade deficit. This totaled $49 billion of Japan in 1989. But the flip side of this was that the Japanese, like the Chinese now, were selling more stuff to than they were buying from a particular trade partner, giving them a surplus. Where America piled up consumer goods, Japan piled up dollars. Surely the Americans were doing better out of this, but what could Japan do with these dollars? They sent them home, using them to buy assets like the Mobile Building in New York in 1987, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in 88, and the Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan in 89. These dollar inflows showed up as a surplus on the US capital account, offsetting the deficit on the trade account. Then as now, American producers began demanding and getting protection from Congress and the president. The American auto industry found eager defenders in both parties. During his 1980 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan said, "Japan is part of the problem. This is where government can be legitimately involved. That is to convince the Japanese in one way or another that in their own interest, the deluge of cars must be slowed while our industry gets back on its feet. I thought these conservatives and neoliberals love the free market, but when Japan starts doing better than them in a certain industry, then they must protect the American market. Then, as in now, military metaphors entered circulation. In 1985, Senator Benson fretted, "We are in a trade war and we are losing." In 1988, commentator Paul Harvey warned of an economic Pearl Harbor in an article titled "Japan Buys US with Our Money." These weren't fringe ideas. Of 1991's The Coming War of Japan, an actual war, Publishers Weekly wrote that while the authors sometimes overstate their thesis, their scenario is plausible. So the Japanese economy eventually crashed in 1990, but there you saw some more conservative language about what Japan are doing. Like, they are essentially trying to buy America, and there were like literally comics of Japan like doing another Pearl Harbor through the economy, and basically there was a lot of suspicion of Japanese corporations like they were all an arm of the Japanese state and they were trying to get revenge for World War II. Like, people actually did believe this at the time, and you can kind of see that xenophobia and that fear in Cyberpunk as a whole, including the first Blade Runner. And Cyberpunk 2077 has this problem as well because Arasaka is the biggest corporation. Saburo Arasaka, the CEO and like the lord of the corporation, he is actually a Japanese veteran from World War II who wanted to use his corporation to strike back at America, right? So that really, really plays into this xenophobia and this view of the Japanese during the 1980s, during those formative years of the cyberpunk genre, including the cyberpunk tabletop, which inspired the video game. They just can't shake these inherently xenophobic characteristics of their world. So because Blade Runner 2049 does a far better job at tackling a more like globalized world without really veering into like xenophobia and views on like Asian cultures and Japanese people, I just wanted to talk about this phrase I just heard. Someone called Chloe Gong wrote this, and it's called techno-Orientalism, and I found this really interesting, so I'm just going to talk about this quickly before we talk about Blade Runner 2049. So Chloe Gong wrote a tweet, "The cyberpunk genre came in an age of heavy xenophobia against Asia, and if we want to bring it back, we have to first grapple with the inherent racism and the tropes of feeling technologized, cyborg, and the Asianized West as a stand-in for the fallen West. Techno-Orientalism is fascinating. If you haven't heard about this concept before, it's a phenomenon of imagining Asia and Asians in hypo or hyper-technological terms in cultural productions and political discourse. Most prominently, this appears in the near-future sci-fi of things like Blade Runner, where vast advanced cities are presented as Asian, but it also doesn't have to be that obvious. It can be as simple as the equating of Asians with advanced technology, like naming a megacorp that destroys the universe, Baytech. Techno-Orientalism operates on the same principles as Orientalism by Edward Said. 19th century Europe crafted an imaginary place called the Orient to justify Europe's place in the world. The 21st century Western world continues to pump out imagery and aesthetics of an imaginary Asia to assuage its fears of an Asianized future. And just like Orientalism was not some big mass movement, Techno-Orientalism is not a conscious effort either. I'm not accusing every sci-fi writer of sitting in a big room and stroking their chins while plotting how Asia can be depicted as the big bad in the next blockbuster. Falling victim to these tropes goes much deeper on the level which we consume global affairs at large. While 19th century Europe sipped tea and spoke of savages out in the unconquered world, 21st century America consumes news articles after news article about Chinese takeovers of American factories and jobs, Japanese technology light years ahead, North Korea missiles within range for firing. Techno-Orientalist tropes bloom from anxieties and fears of a dying American dominance, and in a world where America struggles to understand its place in the world. I think that phrase, Techno-Orientalism, and the explanation of it fits in with a lot of what I've just been saying about Orientalism, but I like the new phrase, and I like the angle talking about like how far in the future Asia is. Like, Japan is always held up as like, we won't be like that society for years and years and years. That also plays into the fetishization of places like Japan, where everyone thinks it's like this homogenous model society, and the far right believe it's only been achieved by them being ethnically homogenous, which of course isn't true, and of course is also ridiculous. But also the xenophobia around Japanese people is happening with Chinese people as well. The only evidence that ties Chinese corporations more strongly to the government is that you have to be like a member of the Communist Party to be in influential positions of business in the Chinese world. But it's not like you can't buy stock of Chinese corporations. Like, a lot of them are publicly traded. And at the end of the day, they just want to make money, like all corporations. I made a whole video about this, about how China is taking over your video games. There's a company called Tencent, and it keeps buying up a lot of stock in other video game companies. Everyone's like, Chinese censorship is coming. The Chinese takeover of all our games, Chinese propaganda. Not realizing that both, yes, Western corporations do align their interests with Western governments, but also a lot of the times corporations just do whatever the market does because they want to make money. So that is like the inherent xenophobia and techno-Orientalism, I like that phrase, of the cyberpunk genre. And just like with Tolkien really normalizing fantasy races, the xenophobia and just taking Asian aesthetics and not really making it nuanced at all is something that Cyberpunk 2077 has a problem with, and also just Cyberpunk at large. I haven't watched Edgerunners yet. I do want to, so let me know if you feel like it has this problem. But I feel like something that has tackled it in a way better way, and I think should be the blueprint for the future of the genre, is Blade Runner 2049. So I am going to elaborate on this further, but we're going to go through some interviews with Denis Villeneuve and just talk about like the world of Blade Runner. But even from the aesthetics, if you watch these movies side by side or one after another, you can see how the second Blade Runner does not use the Asian aesthetic as much. Like, sure, Kay, the main character, he eats sushi. He goes to this place where it has like the Japanese products on the wall and stuff. You do have like these holograms, like the geisha hologram, and you have some Japanese writing. But I feel like that is really the extent of it in a lot of ways. And I feel what's more apparent in this universe is that it's more inspired by the West. And it's more inspired by, like I said, Russia. It's more inspired by Hungary. It's more inspired by Canada. It's more inspired by places like Spain. Like the opening shot, I believe, was even filmed in a part of Spain. It's a more like globalized future, which is based on the 2017 world it came out of, just as the old Blade Runner was inspired by the 1980s. And primarily the fear in the new Blade Runner isn't a fear of immigration. It's not a fear of one group of people taking over. It's the anxieties we have of the planet being completely destroyed by capitalism, which goes hand in hand with climate change, because capitalism has in many ways caused climate change. There's a direct correlation with the birth of modern capitalism and industrialization and the rate of CO2 emissions and the rate of global warming. At this point, it's an inarguable fact. Like, you cannot even say that capitalism hasn't caused climate change. But let's get into the influences of this world a bit more and how Denis Villeneuve didn't completely take the aesthetic from the first movie and build on it, rather than take parts of it and really create his own new cyberpunk. So in an interview with Time, it says, "More than anything, Blade Runner is a story about the end of empire, capitalism taken to its grim, logical conclusion. That is the case for both the 1982 classic and the long-awaited sequel starring Harrison Ford and Ryan Gosling. The profit motive has destroyed the environment. The wealthy have fled to colonies off-world, and those who remain on Earth, humans and androids alike, live in dense squalor, congested by pollution and garish advertisements. And yet it's also beautiful." Director Denis Villeneuve says that despite the bleakness of 2049's subject matter, his film is fundamentally an optimistic one, and the interviewer asks, "You face a daunting task, not only making a sequel to one of the most celebrated films of all time, but also dealing with a highly specific visual world. What traits of the original film do you feel you needed to preserve? In the first movie, you were seeing layers of time. Most of the time in sci-fi movies, the world is purely a vision of the future. But in the original Blade Runner, you felt the dirt that was coming out of the ages. That was something I wanted to bring back. I wanted to make sure that we were as specifically true to the film noir as the first movie was. I wanted the atmosphere to carry this beautiful melancholy that was so powerful in the first movie. I wanted the world to be one of bleakness and gloom, but to have sparks of beauty coming out of technology or humanity." Ridley built this movie as an extension of the late 70s. He took the main currents of the 70s, the fashion, the aesthetics, and brought them into the future. Me, I had to struggle with the problem of having to deal with a movie that was made in 1982 that talked about 2019. 2019 is tomorrow. As we all know, there's a difference between the future world of Blade Runner and today's reality. So I came to the conclusion that I needed to deal with an alternate universe to start with the world of the first Blade Runner and extend it into the future in order to create continuity between the films. I went back to all the cultural references of the first movie and imagined how they would evolve. I went back to the Philip K. Dick novel and explored the geopolitics of the book. In the book, the USSR was still present. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to think, what if the USSR was still alive? What if it was as strong a cultural and economic force as the US, but with different political laws? You see McDonald's in Moscow. What if you saw Russian products in the street of Los Angeles? I thought that would create an interesting distorted reality that would tell my audience right from the start that they're in a different world with different laws from a geopolitical point of view. In this world, there's no more countries, only a few megapolises. Los Angeles, maybe New York, maybe London, that survived because they were built around spaceports. You see refugees coming from everywhere, huddling around those spaceports. The idea is to leave Earth. The police is there to keep the population under control while they're still on Earth. I wanted to show humanity's relationship with nature, how human beings are disconnected more and more from nature, how we are trying to control nature. There is a lack of humility. We are trying to control nature when that nature is stronger than us by far. At the end of the day, I don't know anyone who will outlast it. So just more on the influences of Blade Runner's visual world. So Villeneuve used Canadian light in Blade Runner 2049, an extract from movie trivia. A foundational element, as with all of Villeneuve's films, is light, specifically identifying how natural light in 2049 would look and feel. It was also a way for the French-Canadian filmmaker to find a personal way into the enormous sequel of a cinematic hero's film. The light is grey, that silver winter light that could peek through and be present in some scenes instead of being total black like the first Blade Runner, said Villeneuve. It looks like Montreal right now. To bring that light into the movie is a way for me to bring the movie close to me. It's light from home, also strangely made Ridley's dream mine. So we all like a bit of IMDb trivia, and I just went on this at the last second before I filmed this to see if I was missing anything. A couple bits of trivia which kind of just prove my analysis of this being less Asian influence. So Edward James Olmos, who is of Hungarian descent, famously improvised a line in Hungarian in Blade Runner 1982. He mentions that Rick Deckard is now Nu Dies, retired. He repeats the word to Kay in the movie as well. Furthermore, an old Hungarian woman is heard ranting in the hallways of Kay's apartment building, and most of the movie is filmed in Budapest. The greenhouse at Sapper Morton's farm bear the word Selena is a reference to Nikita Khrushchev's Virgin Islands campaign in the Soviet Union, when citizens were moved to sparsely populated lands to start farms and grow food. This is the first example of the mix of various language used throughout the movie. The Wallace Corporation's alert sound is from Peter and the Wolf. Kay's baseline test is from Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire. So obviously there are lots of references to Eastern and Central Europe, but I just think the general aesthetic, the snow, the overcast, the snow is not present in the first Blade Runner. It is heavily present in the second Blade Runner. And of course, you can talk about Canada and Montreal, but also this was filmed in Hungary. It has influences from the old Soviet Union, has references to Soviet programs and stuff like that. I think it's very clear Eastern Europe plays a lot bigger influence in this film. And I think it's actually helpful in making Cyberpunk feel more globalized, feel more realistic, and not feel like it's stealing from a specific culture and just using that as an aesthetic. It actually is kind of using European culture and Eastern European culture to kind of say something and take references from, like Sapper Morton's farm, for example. I didn't know that until I read the trivia. That is really interesting. He also talks about the influence of the Soviet Union. That is, of course, referenced in the actual book. Have people from the Soviet Union come into LA. Generally, I don't know what you guys think, especially if you're from one of the Asian countries Cyberpunk kind of steals its aesthetics from. But I feel like Blade Runner 2049 does a good job in addressing this by just making it more globalized, so you can believe more that the Asian parts of the cyberpunk culture are more natural and indicative of a globalized society or a globalized city, like Los Angeles, like London, for example, rather than being based in xenophobia or fetishization or Orientalism. It's more based on the culture we have today, which I find interesting about the contrast between both films. But of course, one of the biggest differences, like I said, is the fears of both directors and creators in creating these worlds. So in Ridley Scott's film, whether he did it on purpose or not, you have the Japanese takeover element, but you also have ecological collapse, and you also have just rampant neoliberalism destroying the whole planet. And 2049 takes us to an even further extreme where climate change has essentially altered the planet, destroyed most of it. And you have LA having like a massive seawall to protect it from the sea levels rising. You have comments on various characters talking about how like wood is very expensive and no one really has it. One of the replicants says they've never seen a tree before. They don't even know the tree was dead. And then you have like the contrast with Kay's character finding a flower on the grave of Rachel and how that's pretty much like the only place you see something like this in the entire film, apart from Neander Wallace's building, which has so much wood in it, which is really just showing like his general wealth. So ecological collapse is a big, fear that we have right now. And actually, I feel like since Blade Runner came out, it's becoming more and more apparent. And I know that sounds weird to say, and many people might say, it's been happening for years, you guys didn't realize. I think we did realize, but I think it's been happening far more and more explicitly with like massive heat waves in the UK. I think it was like 40 degrees Celsius in London. I said to my girlfriend, it's depressing that I've become acclimatized to Asia through living in the summer in London because it was hotter there than it is here. Then you have like massive floods in Germany, all the crazy stuff happening in parts of North America, including Canada, with like these massive heat waves. So that leaves us with, I guess, Cyberpunk as a whole, and where does Cyberpunk kind of go from the legacy of both Blade Runner films. So you have Cyberpunk 2077, which is clearly one of the most popular Cyberpunk things around right now. Edgerunners, massive hit for Netflix, and the game has seen a massive surge in popularity. And I absolutely love the game. I think it's so well written. I think so many of the characters are amazing. If you like The Witcher 3's characters, you'll love Cyberpunk's characters. I love the relationships between people like V and Johnny and Kerry, and I love Panam. The music is absolutely incredible. The score is so good. Annoyingly, like most companies, they left some of the best tracks off the actual official soundtrack, so I just listen to them on my YouTube like premium. But the way the whole game is also about music is so good as well. Like, it has made up music from the band Samurai, which is fronted by two of the characters in the game, and then it weaves the notes and the riffs from that music into the actual score, and it sounds completely different. And every quest is named after like a real life song. And like the whole game is really about music. And again, if you haven't tried it, if you have a PS5 especially, please check this out. But it has the problem. And I actually don't think the devs at Cyberpunk have the capability to address this problem, because fundamentally the Cyberpunk IP has this as part of its universe, this xenophobia, this racism. But also when you see the devs like simping for Elon Musk, even recently, it's like, what are you doing? Like, do you not even understand what your game is about? Like, I know a lot of people have criticized the politics of the game itself, but it's very clear that the whole genre is pretty much about anti-capitalism because no one wants to live in these worlds. Like, sure, they look cool, but you wouldn't want to live there as your average citizen. So again, I don't know if these people are capable of tackling this, but in the future, I think there can be more films like 2049, which show a globalized world, which show a globalized aesthetic, which show even Asian influence, whether that be, Mongolian in the score of Blade Runner, whether that be Japanese, Chinese, different Asian languages, Russian, things like that. It can show all this stuff and create a very realistic, cyberpunk future world of what our future is today. You are not a bad person for liking Cyberpunk. You're not a bad person for even enjoying the Asian Hong Kong / Tokyo aesthetic of the films and the genre. But I think it's important moving forward that a lot of these films are told by white Western men and created by just people who grew up in the West, viewing Asian culture from the outside. And if you want to make Cyberpunk from a Western perspective, do what Villeneuve did rather than what Ridley Scott did, because then you're taking like your own experience of growing up in like a globalized Canadian city and applying it to the future, rather than what Ridley Scott did, where he grew up in somewhere like, northern England and took the aesthetics of Tokyo and Hong Kong as a backdrop for his film without really giving any nuance, really reviving old Orientalist tropes, and as a byproduct, because the film became so successful later on in its life, influence a whole subgenre which still has the problems that Scott and his team created in the original. So obviously there is lots of East Asian and just general Asian cinema, media, which has like reclaimed cyberpunk. There's Japanese cyberpunk, there's Korean cyberpunk, there's all this stuff created by people in those countries. And I'm not really talking about that here, of course. I'm just talking about the dominant strain of cyberpunk, which is Western Cyberpunk. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Let me know what you thought of the video. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.